The largest grain export complex on Earth cannot be reached by train. 98% of the grain leaving it arrives by barge, on a river. And in 2022, that river ran out of water, and the grain did not take the train. It did not go anywhere. That figure is the Agriculture Department's own, and it is not about cost. It is about connectivity. American railroads move enormous volumes of grain, but to different ports, on different oceans, for different buyers. The Pacific Northwest facing Asia and the Texas Gulf. Rail does not physically serve most of these berths. The substitute exists. It is not connected to these docks. So when the water drops, 4 autumns running now, the corn and soybeans of the American interior have no second way to reach a ship. They wait, or somebody pays, or they stay in the field. That is a live constraint on a river 1,000 miles inside the borders of the country that depends on it. The complex itself is 150 miles of docks on the lower Mississippi in Louisiana, between Baton Rouge and a place called Myrtle Grove, and the elevators there were built to receive barges rather than rail cars. That construction decision is the whole argument. To see why there is no second way, draw the path a bushel of soybeans actually takes. It is not a network, it is a chain, in series, 1 link per stage. It starts in a field in Illinois or Iowa, goes by truck to a country elevator, and from there to a river terminal on the Mississippi or one of its working tributaries, the Illinois, the Ohio, the Arkansas. There it is loaded into a barge. A barge is a rectangular steel box with no engine. 15 get lashed into a single tow, pushed by 1 towboat, and that tow carries what would otherwise need 1,050 trucks, or 216 rail cars, behind 6 locomotives, a modal comparison from the Texas A&M Transportation Institute. Treat those ratios loosely. The study's lineage sits inside the waterways sector, and its data ends in 2014. The direction holds, even if the precision does not. From there, the tow travels 1,000 miles downstream, through a chain of locks and dams, to the export elevators above New Orleans, where the grain is poured into an ocean vessel. Now ask which link has a second copy. The farms are many and interchangeable. The trucks are fungible. The ocean vessel is fungible. Ships are the most substitutable asset in world trade. The river is not. There is one Mississippi. Its depth is set by rainfall across the basin it drains, and a lock does not have a spare lock beside it. That is the map. A commodity superpower exporting through a single physical corridor with no parallel copy. And the constriction is not a foreign strait. It is domestic, it is inland, and its operating condition is set by the weather. In the autumn of 2022, drought across the Mississippi basin dropped the river to a record low. At Memphis, the gauge read almost 11 feet below zero on the 17th of October, under the previous record set in 1988. Sandbars surfaced mid-channel. Barges grounded. When the water drops, the response is mechanical. Load the barges less deeply, make the tows narrower to fit what is left of the channel. A dry cargo barge normally sits about 12 feet deep and carries around 1,500 tons. Every foot of draft given up removes roughly 200 tons, about 7,000 bushels of soybeans that stay on the bank. In 2022 and again in 2023, drafts were cut and tow sizes reduced by 9 to 46%, depending on the stretch of river. So the corridor did not close, it narrowed, and the price of using it did what prices do when supply contracts against a harvest that arrives on schedule anyway. On the mid-Mississippi benchmark, the Agriculture Department publishes weekly. Barge freight to the Gulf reached $105.86 per ton in the week of the 11th of October, 2022, an all-time high in a series running back to 2004. The same benchmark averaged just under $12 a ton across 2024, a normal water year. $12 to 106. That is not a market being tight. That is a market discovering it has nowhere else to go. A price spike like that is a natural experiment, and this one has a clean result. The standard way to think about freight is that modes compete. If one path gets expensive, cargo moves to another. That is the assumption underneath nearly every claim that transport costs sort themselves out. Barge freight went to an all-time record. The posted rail tariff did not move. Under ordinary substitution logic, grain should have poured onto the railroads. The size of that gap is the easiest thing here to overstate. Working from the Agriculture Department's own two series, barge rates per ton, rail tariffs per bushel, converted onto the same unit, a normal water bushel moves by barge for about 36 cents, and the posted rail tariff on a comparable corn belt to Louisiana Gulf lane runs 58 to 68 cents. In an ordinary year, rail costs between 1.5 and twice what barge costs. A real gap, and an unremarkable one. It would not on its own support a single claim in this argument. At the October 2022 peak, the relationship inverted. Barge went to about $3.18 a bushel against a posted rail tariff near 58. Barge was now several times the cost of rail. Call it 3 to 5 times, depending on how you account for the secondary railcar market, where shuttle cars bid $1,700 above tariff that same month. That is our own calculation, joining two series never designed to be joined. I would not defend the exact multiple. I would defend the direction. For weeks, the river was decisively the expensive way to reach a ship. So the test is simple. Did the grain switch? It did not. For the week ending the 12th of October 2022, the same week barge freight hit its all-time high, American grain rail carloads came to 26,027. The Agriculture Department reports that as 1% below the same week a year earlier. Not 1% above. Below. Meanwhile, the barges carried far less. Across September to November of 2022, downbound barge tonnage of corn, soybeans and wheat came to about 16 million tons, against an average of 21.5 million over the preceding 7 years. A fall of about 25%. The following autumn it fell again by nearly 30. Set those two numbers beside each other. Barge, down 25%. Rail, down 1%. The volume that left the river did not arrive on the railway. It did not go by truck either. 1,000 truckloads per tow is not a shortfall a highway system absorbs at harvest. The grain did not switch modes. It did not move. And there is a second half to that finding, printed in the same Agriculture Department report, on the same page. That week, unfilled grain car orders, rail cars shippers had ordered and not received, were up 413% on the year before, and up 63% on the previous week alone. They had already touched an all-time record that summer, around 17,200 cars. Full-year grain car loadings finished 2022 about 5% below the year before. So the railroad was not a spare tire sitting idle while shippers stubbornly stayed on the river. The railroad was short itself. At the precise moment the alternative was needed, the alternative was oversubscribed, and its posted price was a number you could read but not buy at. That is what distinguishes a choke point from an expensive route. An expensive route reroutes. A choke point does not offer the option. The consequence does not stop at a freight rate. It lands on a price, unevenly, in a pattern that is itself a map. Grain in the American interior is priced as basis, the local cash price relative to the futures contract. When it costs more to get a bushel from a river terminal to a ship, that cost comes out of the bushel at the terminal. The exporter still needs the grain, and somebody upstream pays the freight. In October 2022, Soybeans at Helena, Arkansas, a river terminal, were bid 90 cents under the futures price against a 5-year seasonal average of about 30 cents under. The weakest print that month was 125 under. Greenville, Mississippi, 111. West Central Tennessee, 95. At the Gulf, meanwhile, soybean basis went to a record premium near $3 a bushel, and corn basis to nearly $2, the highest since 2000. Those two moves point in opposite directions, and the spread between them is precisely the freight. And this is what makes it a geography story rather than an agriculture story. The penalty was not national. Researchers at the University of Illinois recorded a steep discount along the upper Mississippi and a milder one in central and western Iowa and northern Illinois. The further a farm sat from a working river terminal, the less the river punished it. A farm already served by rail or a local processor was never inside this dependency at all. The blast radius of an inland choke point is measured in distance from the corridor. That is a sentence you could write about the Strait of Hormuz. It is being written here about a river inside the borders of the country that depends on it. Everything so far is a weather story. There is a second vulnerability on the same corridor, and the two have to be kept separate because only one of them has been tested. The inland waterway system runs on locks, chambers that lift and lower vessels past the dams holding the river at a navigable depth. There are 237 lock chambers at 192 sites. Most of the Mississippis were built between about 1930 and 1940 to an estimated 50-year design life, and many still contain original components now around 90 years old. As of 2024, the American Society of Civil Engineers puts roughly 80% of the lock and dam infrastructure on the inland waterways past that design life, grades the system C-, and records a deferred maintenance backlog of $7.5 billion. What matters is not the age. Old infrastructure that works is just infrastructure. What matters is where the locks sit in the chain. They are in series. A toe that cannot pass a lock does not take a different lock. There is no different lock. And be exact about what this does not prove. No lock failure caused the 2022 event. That was river stage, rainfall, not steel. The aging lock chain is a separate, latent exposure the drought years did not test, and some of it is being addressed. The 2021 infrastructure law put $17.1 billion into Army Corps' accounts. So a corridor with no parallel path has two ways to constrict: the water in it and the machinery along it. The first has been demonstrated, the second has not, and the distance between those sentences is the distance between analysis and prophecy. Leaving out the next part would make this both worse and wrong. Low water on the Mississippi has now recurred 4 autumns running, 2022 through 2025, with Coast Guard draft limits and tow restrictions in force in all 4. If this were a story about an escalating crisis, the price signal would be climbing. It is falling. On the Memphis benchmark, the autumn peak barge rate was $88 a ton in 2022, $53 in 2023, $26 in 2024, $20 in 2025. For scale, 2021, a year nobody remembers as a crisis, peaked at 31. The last 2 low-water autumns produced freight peaks inside the range of an ordinary harvest. That is real, and it deserves a real explanation. The system learned. River forecasts feed shipping decisions earlier. Barges get pre-positioned before the water drops rather than after. Grain gets booked forward, dredging starts earlier, and everyone has now done this 4 times. A first encounter with a constraint is always the most expensive one. But notice exactly what improved. The management of the shock improved. The structure underneath it did not change. The Center Gulf elevators still take about 98% of their grain by barge. Rail's share of deliveries into those elevators did not rise during either event. No new rail-served export terminal appeared on the Louisiana Gulf. Not one link acquired a second copy. Adaptation is not redundancy. A country that gets better at anticipating a drought has not acquired a second river. There is a temptation here that I am going to decline, and it is worth naming because the shape of the data invites it. In calendar 2023, Brazil exported roughly 2,200 million bushels of corn against the United States' 1,797, passing the United States for the first time since 2019 and taking around 30% of the world market. Brazilian corn exports have risen 11-fold since 2004. American corn exports over the same period show no significant growth at all. Two lines crossing in the same year, the Mississippi hit a record low, is an inviting picture. It is not, as far as the evidence goes, a causal one. The agricultural economists at the University of Illinois who track this attribute the shift to factors on the Brazilian side. A 67% expansion in planted area, the rise of safrinha second-crop corn, now about 3/4 of Brazilian production, heavy investment in the northern arc ports that handle around 40% of Brazil's corn and soy exports, a phytosanitary agreement with China signed in November 2022 that moved 635 million bushels in a year, supply gaps from the war in Ukraine, and trade tension between Washington and Beijing. None of that is the Mississippi. The defensible claim is narrower and still worth making. A river shock arrives on an American export position already eroding for reasons of its own. The choke point compounds a trend it did not start. A corridor with no second path is simply a worse thing to be holding while a competitor expands. So who holds this risk? Not the world's buyers. Through all 4 low-water autumns, the grain got exported, and no importing country went short. This was never a story about closure, and anyone telling it as one is telling it wrong. It is a story about cost and margin, and about who absorbs both. The exposure sits with whoever is closest to the water. A farm within reach of a river terminal is the one bid 90 cents under futures instead of 30. The barge operators carry it, in a fleet sized for a channel whose capacity is set by rainfall. The export elevators carry it, 98% committed to one inbound mode by construction, an extraordinary posture for infrastructure handling a strategic commodity. And an inland shock transfers advantage to any exporter whose route to a ship does not run through it. The Pacific Northwest, the Texas Gulf, every competitor with a different corridor. The federal government carries the residual, the Army Corps dredges, the Coast Guard sets drafts, Congress funds locks, which is the one genuinely reassuring feature here. Unlike a strait on the far side of the world, every actor with authority over this choke point answers to the same government as the farmers who depend on it. That is not nothing. It is just not a second route. The instinct with a story like this is to watch the river, gauge readings, drought maps, the autumn freight rate. Those are the numbers that make the news, and they are the wrong ones. They measure the weather, and the weather will keep doing what it does. The number that would mean something is the modal share into the center Gulf. About 98% of the grain arriving at those elevators arrives by barge. If that ever falls materially, a serious rail-served export terminal on the Louisiana Gulf, or export volume shifting durably toward the Pacific Northwest and the Texas Gulf, the corridor has acquired a parallel copy, and this argument dates. That is its falsification condition, and it is worth saying out loud. A claim you cannot imagine losing is not an argument. Until then, the map stands. Close to half of American corn, soybean, and wheat exports reach the sea through the Mississippi system, and the elevators handling the largest part of it are connected to nothing but the river, a chain of gates built in the 1930s, at a depth set by rainfall. When that corridor narrows, the volume does not find another way. The choke points that get named are the ones a rival could close. Hormuz, Malacca, the canals. This one nobody could close, and nobody has to. It has no second copy, and it never needed an enemy to matter.